is a state where countries are de-dollarizing, they are de-treasurizing, they are selling the dollar, they are selling the treasury, they are settling commodity transactions in other currencies. And instead of putting the excess, as was the deal of the petrodollar deal, which just ended last week, they didn't re-up it, Saudi Arabia didn't, where you sell commodities, in particular oil, in US dollars through OPEC globally, which created a synthetic demand for the dollar worldwide for 50 years. Everyone had to stockpile it. And then you take any excess and invest them into treasuries. Well, what we see is a mass exodus out of treasuries by the central banks of the world and a mass accumulation into what the Bank of International Settlements reclassified as the world's only other tier one reserve asset, that's gold.
Welcome back to Metals and Miners. I'm its founder and its host, Gary Boehm. We have a great discussion lined up today that I'm very excited about. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Andy Schectman. Andy, along with his father, David, founded Miles Franklin Precious Metals Investments, now a $9 billion company. Their vision is to offer a wide variety of bullion and numismatic products, extensive broker expertise, and fair pricing to their clientele. Prior to starting Miles Franklin in 1989, Andy became a licensed financial planner specialized in Swiss franc investments and alternative investments. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Gary, thanks for having me, buddy. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Andy, in your analysis, how do you currently see the setup in the state of the markets, economy, and the geopolitical tension that's going on around the world?
Yeah, that's a big one, but I think it all centers around, it's all pretty much the same question wrapped into a big ball that centers around the loss of confidence, if you will, in a system that's really based on confidence. Whether you're talking about the dollar or the bond market, we're no longer pegged to gold, and it's a system that is based on the confidence of the U.S. economy and the U.S. government. The problem is, the world is looking at us like what's happened to the United States, whether we talk about what's happened here at home with the lawlessness in the cities and the open borders that have destroyed the immigration system where everyone came here to assimilate legally and contribute to the country. We now have 17 million people in here illegally that are creating issues, you should say, I guess we could say, in terms of how we pay for these people, their schooling, their funding, for medical or for food or for housing. What if 1% of them wants to cause problems in the United States? That's 170,000 people. How about 5%? That's bigger than any standing army. How about the lawlessness in the inner cities, or the judicial system that once was the beacon of why people wanted to come here for freedom and liberty and justice? Lady Liberty standing, holding the scales of justice, blindfolded, and people are questioning, is the system two-tiered? Is it fair? Or the electoral system, where people wonder, is it fair? I'm not making any comment on it, but I'll simply say I think there is a perception of this being questioned around the globe. How about the move away from things like the nuclear family, or cancel culture, or censorship, things that made this country great? Even boil it all the way down to the very basic things like the Pledge of the Allegiance we don't say anymore in schools, and where our value is no longer based upon merit, but upon our sexual preference and our lifestyle agenda. These are things that are not lost on the rest of the world, making them say, what the hell is going on in the United States? Add to it a country that is accumulating $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. It took us 200 years to do that the first time. 1 trillion seconds ago, Gary, was 31,688 years ago. Now, when you talk about all that we've done to upset the apple cart here at home and allow these things to happen, we look at what we've done around the world. And we have, first and foremost, our lead economic advisor to the United States government is a man named Jared Bernstein, who has a degree in music and a master's degree in social work from Columbia University, where they did teach the Cloward-Piven theory, and that's where Obama went to school too. People should research the Cloward-Piven theory. Blow your damn mind when you read it and how it fits into exactly what's happening right now. Those are husband and wife professors who taught in the 60s on how to bring down the whole system and create universal basic income and move from a capitalist to a socialist economy. I'll leave that for another discussion, but people should research it. It'll take 10 minutes to read about it, and you'll be freaked out. But this man, Jared Bernstein, his whole thesis is to lose the reserve status of the U.S. government. And he's written reports called Dethrone King Dollar, in which he advocates for the immediate dismissal of the reserve status. It's a privilege we can't afford any longer because of the distortions and imbalances it creates. And you look at how we've signed an executive order to go green, pushing all of these countries into the BRICS fold, most of them oil-producing countries and commodity-producing countries. And then at the same time, we weaponize the dollar against Russia. Now, it's one thing to weaponize and sanction like we did Iran, but it's a whole nother thing to do what the House just did, to vote to confiscate, let's call it what it is, steal $5 billion in Russian assets and treasuries and use those proceeds to fund munitions to give to the foe that they're fighting. And when you cross that line, that's like breaking the glass against the wall and trying to put it back together before mom comes home. Ain't gonna happen. You have destroyed a good amount of trust across the entire Southern Hemisphere, where if we don't align ideologically, well, you know what? We're gonna confiscate your assets. And yet the world looks at us and says, well, look, didn't Janet Yellen just tell CNBC that if she's okay in a very benevolent way of Russia and China being friends? Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. But if China gives 1 penny to Russia for their war efforts, that they will sanction their companies, their banks. We will sanction their companies, their banks, and even Beijing itself. Never mind the fact that we've given $260 billion to the Ukraine, given them Javelin missiles and F-16s and the intelligence on where to fire things, because we don't count. It doesn't matter. What matters is what we say, not what we do. This amount of hypocrisy is not resonating well through much of the world. So when you talk about what is the state of the world right now, it is a state where countries are de-dollarizing, they are de-treasurizing, they are selling the dollar, they are selling the treasury, they are settling commodity transactions in other currencies. And instead of putting the excess, as was the deal of the petrodollar deal, which just ended last week, they didn't re-up it, Saudi Arabia didn't, where you sell commodities, in particular oil, in US dollars through OPEC globally, which created a synthetic demand for the dollar worldwide for 50 years. Everyone had to stockpile it. And then you take any excess and invest them into treasuries. Well, what we see is a mass exodus out of treasuries by the central banks of the world and a mass accumulation into what the Bank of International Settlements reclassified as the world's only other tier 1 reserve asset, that's gold. And these banks not only are massively accumulating it, but they are repatriating it and bringing it home, removing counterparty risk. So I see an environment of mismanagement and irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy, an environment of lack of trust or the breaking of trust globally in all things U.S., in our markets, in the way we report what inflation or unemployment is, in the way that we handle our elections or immigration, our justice system. Everything is being questioned, or even the way we view the nuclear family. And I see a situation where that trust is being usurped, or that trust is, that lack of trust is fostering a drive into commodities, which Zoltan Pozsar, the former New York Fed representative and now UBS expert on the plumbing of the system, says we are in a system he calls Bretton Woods 3. Bretton Woods 1, when we took over for the pound sterling after World War II, backed our currency by gold, and then de Gaulle from France started to drain all the gold, so Nixon closed the gold window. Bretton Woods 2, when we struck the petrodollar deal 50 years ago last week, that's over. He says Bretton Woods 3 is a system all about commodities and transparency. And we are pushing, I believe, the world into the realization that the commodities that they accumulate, gold, silver, rare earths, base metals, the Chinese bought the London Metals Exchange three years ago. That is the epicenter of base metals, copper, zinc, lead, steel. They're striking deals all around the world in commodities in Africa and in South America. They already produce the majority of all the rare earth minerals, and they not produce, but refine 100% of all the rare earth metals and all of the things that we need. They're accumulating. They're also joining together in a realization that these commodities are more valuable than the currencies that purchase them. We are entering a very scary time where I believe things that have made this country great, and in particular the world reserve currency, which has allowed us to live beyond our means, is slowly, little by little by little by little by little, coming to an end and being replaced with a system of mutual cooperation, of commodities, and of transparency. And we can dig into that as much as you want, but everything that I've been following for 4 years, Gary, tells me this is accelerating. And what we saw last week in Russia with Saudi Arabia and the decisions that the Crown Prince made are going to accelerate this trend in a massive fashion.
So there's a lot of pieces to that I'm going to pull on during our time together over the next 50 minutes. The current administration has run, like you just said, a record non-recessionary, non-wartime deficit with historic spending leading to a fresh new $1 trillion in deficit every 100 days or so, just like you said. The deficit spending has been coined fiscal dominance. Do you expect more fiscal dominance if Biden is reelected in November? And what are you expecting if we see a change in the White House to former President Trump?
Well, I mean, if the current administration retains the office, God help us all. And the amount of fiscal dominance should be considered the most irresponsible fiscal policy in the history of humankind, where money is being spent at a level that look, let's just quantify how big it is. $1 trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago. These numbers are so big that they can never be repaid. And that ignores things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and government and military pensions and all the entitlements. Medicare Part B is 99 trillion in the hole. Medicare Part D, the prescriptions, is 22 trillion. Social Security, 77 trillion. We're almost 200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So balance the budget today. Totally balanced, right? How the hell do you pay 150, 175 trillion in unfunded liabilities? Who's going to pay for that when the countries that have been accumulating our treasuries, largely China and Japan and these Saudi Arabia, these countries are now dumping our treasuries. China was at 3 trillion. They're down to 700 billion. They're selling treasuries and replacing it with things like gold, which is the only other tier one asset in the world as reclassified in 2019 by the BIS.
Andy, let me ask you on that specific point that you're just making about China. They've been leading the central bank charge to buy gold, just like you've said, over the last several years. That's helped push the price of gold up into record territory. But last week, it was announced, I'm not saying it's legit, but it was announced that China has stopped buying gold with its reserves. And then the price of gold really fell hard. You probably remember this. And then since it's rebounded, it's stabilized some below where it was. What do you make of that announcement or that perspective in light of the existing debt situation the U.S. has? And as you're pointing out, the extremely low probability that the U.S. could ever pay back these bonds in a non-depreciating currency. It's just not going to happen. So what do you make of that? Was that just propaganda?
Yeah, I view that as one of the I don't know, it's laughable as far as I'm concerned. And look, this is about as premature of a conclusion as I've ever seen. And I think that how can anyone assert based on a single report showing unchanged monthly holdings that they're not buying? But even crazier in that is that for years, everyone would say, you can't believe the numbers that China gives us on their gold holdings because they haven't changed in years. There was an analyst that for the Bank of Montreal last month who said the numbers that China is reporting are fugazi. The IMF said the same thing. They're the largest producers of it in the world and have been using our trade imbalance to mine gold, even uneconomical gold, for years. And these numbers that they tell us, one of my favorite analysts and economists in this industry is Alistair McLeod, who will tell you they have 38,000 metric tons, not the 2,700 that they are telling us, that the people own as much as 18,000 metric tons and the state 20. We supposedly have 8,300 metric tons, but we haven't audited it since 1956. So the numbers that we get coming out of China, we're all of a sudden supposed to believe it. I find it to be complete and total garbage. And just because they updated their numbers for 19 straight months, I would argue the amount of gold that they are producing around in China and accumulating around the world through various sources, including opaque sources like sovereign wealth funds. Remember, gold accumulated off the London Metals Exchange is not an exchange like the COMEX. It's called over-the-counter, where they're bilateral agreements. I'm trading with you. There's less transparency, there's less regulation, and it's between me and you. No one knows how much gold they have, and they didn't update their numbers for many years. So it's just like all the other Western media BS crap that spins a negative yarn, if you will, about gold. And I don't believe it for 1 second, especially when we talk about, hopefully here, the news that just came out of these meetings in Russia on what's called the unit, which is going to be the new BRIC settlement currency, as acknowledged not only by Putin and Sergei Glazyev, the economic minister for the Eurasian Economic Union, but also by the head of the new BRICS Development Bank. And a 40% gold backing is what was acknowledged to it.
Let's talk about that. The BRICS nations and de-dollarization has been going on. The BRICS are working with each other to trade in their respective currencies and settle the differences in gold. They're doing this out in the open. It's no secret. So far, the differences in the dollar utilization has been very small, kind of on the margins, if you will. However, the transactions are adding up and they're expanding. So in your analysis, what impact do you see de-dollarization having over the next few years? What time frame do you believe the U.S. will stop sitting idly by and watching it happen without taking any kind of action, including military? And what's your take on the unit that has come out with that paper just recently?
Well, I mean, first of all, when you realize the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group in Washington, one of the last, said that by 2031, that 100% of tax revenue will go just to pay the interest on the debt and the mandatory entitlement payments like Medicare and Social Security. But when you realize that that means that things like defense spending, which is discretionary, would have to be borrowed, how do we ever intend on maintaining our dominance when in 6 years, which doesn't include the 17 million people that came in here illegally, how are we going to pay for them? These numbers will massively be understated. And how do we maintain military and financial dominance as a broke country where we have to borrow even money for our military? As far as gold, let's remember that it was reclassified the world's only other tier one reserve asset in 2019. And one of the things that we are seeing, for example, the Bank of India bought 24 tons of gold, which is 1.5 times what they purchased in 2023. They bought that in the first 4 months of this year, and they repatriated 100 metric tons. Almost all of their gold now is held in India instead of the Bank of England. They brought it back from the Bank of England, which is otherwise known as the London Metals Exchange, or the LBMA, where they can trade. But when we go back to 2018 and 17, we saw the Bundesbank from Germany, the Bank of Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Austria, the Dutch National Bank, the Czech National Bank, they all brought their gold home from the New York Fed and then went on a massive buying spree. Those banks bought more gold next year as they did in the 60 years previously combined and haven't stopped. And here we are now. The numbers of the central banks buying gold is off the charts. Q1 2024 was the biggest ever, replacing Q1 2023. And what did we just see? Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, Algeria, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia just brought all their gold home from the New York Fed, which is the COMEX. And so when we talk about how does this happen, the repatriation and the accumulation of gold is of no coincidence to its reclassification by the most powerful bank in the world as the only other tier one reserve asset. So we had this meeting. We've had 2 meetings over the last 2 weeks. There are 200 meetings, BRICS meetings, leading up to the big one in October. The one last week was in Novograd, where 21,000 people attended from 139 nations, and 80 billion in bilateral deals not using the dollar were settled on the sidelines. 59 nations plan on joining BRICS, we were told, and Putin talked about the new payment system that is being worked on through the new development bank. He also talked about the countries that will be admitted not only will be resource rich, but will have trade logistics and sea routes as a major focus for cooperation. So we go 2 weeks ago, and by the way, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia turned down the meeting, the invitation to the meeting of the G7 that same week, last week. Can't go, he said, but he sent his finance ministers to the meeting in Novograd. Interesting. We go back 2 weeks ago, and this is where it gets very interesting. Putin gives a speech at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And he says the Bretton Woods monetary system is dead and gone. The current one is based on only the confidence of the U.S. And they came out and he said that they are indeed working on a new payment infrastructure independent from the Western ability to pressure and sanction. And he had a meeting there with the president of the BRICS New Development Bank, a lady named Dilma Rousseff, where she acknowledged publicly that indeed we have come to an agreement on something called the unit. Now, Sergei Glaziev, the Russian finance minister, told us 3 years ago they will issue a common settlement currency that will be backed by a basket of currencies of the BRICS plus nations and a basket of commodities. Evidently, they realized that a basket of commodities is too hard to control and predict, so they've decided to just use gold, which is what? The only other tier one reserve asset as categorized by the Bank of International Settlements, the most powerful bank on the planet. The central bank or central bank. And who's been buying all the gold? Oh, yeah, it's the central banks. And who's been repatriating all the gold, bringing it home, removing counterparty risk? Oh, yeah, that's the central banks. So the agreement was that this new transactional settlement currency will be anchored in 40% gold and 60% BRICS plus settlement currencies. And the next day they had a meeting, Putin and Dilma, the head of the BRICS New Development Bank, and Sergei Glaziev, the architect of all of this. And they came out and said, yes, we've discussed the unit, we agree about it, and we are going to have a special conference in Shanghai in September to deal just with this unit. And to me, when they tell you that 59 countries have already formally said they're going to join the BRICS, that this will be discussed in September, it is a high probability they will bring it up and announce it to the world in October. Does it mean they implement it at that point? Don't know. But what it really says is that we are moving towards a system that will be backed on commodities, like Zoltan Pozsar said, Bretton Woods 3, where the trust of the West has been broken by irresponsible monetary and fiscal policy, massive money creation, horrible bond market performance where interest rates rise 500 basis points in a year, destroying the performance of the 10-year, weaponization and confiscation of the Treasury, destabilization of our image back home. All of these things are coming together at the same time. So yes, we will have a currency that will be pegged to the only other tier one asset in the world, but they announced they will transact on something called Project Bridge, which is something I've been talking about for 2 years. And it's a cross-border payment system that was developed between China, Hong Kong, United Arab Emirates, and Singapore, I believe. But it allows these countries to trade their own local currencies, digital currencies, cross-border using Bridge, which sidesteps SWIFT. The first 2 test trades they did last year were China trading digital yuan for gold and for oil cross-border. These are the commodities that are being remonetized and replacing the treasury market because they cannot be weaponized. He or she who has the gold, well, I would say he or she who has the commodities makes the rules. And so when you realize that Project Bridge, where Saudi Arabia just became last week a full participant in it, allows these countries to use their own central bank digital currencies, not one BRICS currency, but their own, trading the digital yuan for the digital real or the digital yuan for oil or whatever it may be. But the settlement is in a common settlement currency, which will be backed by a basket of those BRICS plus countries and 40% gold. This de-incentivizes the holding of U.S. treasuries and dollars exponentially from all of these oil-producing countries who are finding safety in numbers in a growing coalition of countries that right now represents a larger swath of human population, global GDP, military might with 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, all of the rare earths in terms of production and refining, the majority of the gold and the silver, and all of these shipping and trade routes with the Belt Road Initiative and with the North-South Corridor and all of these things combining. You're talking the majority of human population and all of the commodities and all the shipping lanes and a stronger military might. The people who discount this and say this is a nothing burger and this is the underestimation of this will be one of the biggest mistakes that the West ever makes. And what is what is very, I think, admirable if you look at it from a distance about the way these countries are doing this. They are backfilling and being methodical and covering all of their bases before they challenge the West for its supremacy. You could argue with the no longer signing of the Petro deal, the hegemony is over. The supremacy is still there, but for how long? And our actions, both at home and globally, are warranting an expedient change to the current status quo. It's very scary as far as I'm concerned, Gary.
Well, Andy, that's a good segue. You've recently stated what is coming will render you a victim if you're not a contrarian. Would you speak into that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think holding nothing but dollars is the surest way to go broke. I think that you have to be a contrarian. You have to I think look to the fact that these actions have consequences, whether intended or not. And the consequences of all of the world dumping dollars, what starts out slowly, little by little by little, and then goes into a rush as the world accepts a new system, understands that the weaponizing of the dollar and the inflation associated with all of our obligations and unfunded liabilities on top of a $35 trillion debt becomes real. And all of the synthetic demand that was created by all the countries having to stockpile dollars in order to buy oil for 50 years comes to an end. And what started out slowly in terms of de-dollarization and treasurization by the most well-informed countries on the planet who know that this has to be done slowly, opaquely, and not to cut off their nose to spite their face, doing it so fast to maximize their exodus out of the dollar in the treasury market, maximize the amount of value that they get in commodities, using the suppression of the Western paper market to do just that. The West has been suppressing gold and silver through their exchanges for years, going back forever, in order to make an illusion of strength of bond market and strength of currency. And they do that by creating endless number of paper contracts off the same ounce of gold and the amount of money that they have to suppress the price. When these exchanges were founded and this scheme was hatched, these countries in the global south had no coordination, sophistication, wealth. Heck, most of them were third world. They couldn't stand for delivery and screw this up. But they realize, when you realize that the LBMA, the London Metals Bullion Association, they admit to trading 292 million ounces of silver per day, yet they only have 300 million ounces that are unencumbered. There's 800 million ounces on the LBMA of silver, of which 500 belong to the ETF. So they had 300 million supposedly. They're trading that amount every single day, yet they admit to the numbers they post are 10 times understated. If I sell you 50 contracts and buy 100, that's 150 contracts, but the net result is 50. That's all they'll show. That 10 times underreporting would mean they're trading 2.9 billion ounces of silver per day, 3.5 times global mine share. Can you say bullshit? And so when you talk about the rehypothecation, the papering over and over, gives them the ability to mitigate the price. And they've been doing that even in 1974 when the COMEX came online. Right now, silver is 1,600% rehypothecated on COMEX, meaning if everyone stood for delivery, out of 100 people, 7 would get their metal, everyone else would get cash settled, and the market would be done. Doesn't work that way if everyone stands for delivery. And these countries are far more sophisticated now than they have ever been, and wealthy and coordinated and cunning, and they're standing for delivery and they're breaking the system. This will not end well. And what I mean by, if you are not a contrarian, if you believe, if everyone dumped dollars, what started out slowly and then increased because they are moving away from the Western system and moving to a new system where every country's had to stockpile dollars to buy oil, that's over. And if that slow trickle turns into a flood and creates massive levels of inflation, the byproduct of a spike in inflation is a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. And if you have 5% interest rates and 20% inflation, your currency dies. So when interest rates spike, driven by the market, not by Fed Chairman Powell, there's your villain, Xi Jinping and Putin and OPEC did it to us. But if that happens, what is inversely correlated to that? Well, let's start with the banks. At 5%, they all started to blow up. What about at 20%? There is a 0% reserve requirement that changed during COVID. They have no reserves, and all their money is leveraged into fixed income. And as interest rates rise, It blows up the over-leveraged, undercapitalized banks. It blows up the insurance companies loaded with treasuries. The dollar collapses as everyone drops it. It blows up the stock market, the bond market, and the real estate market. Everything resets like that. Could that happen? Klaus Schwab seemed to think it could. Jared Bernstein is advocating for it by weaponizing the dollar and signing executive order to go green and saying we shouldn't have the reserve status anymore. And if that does happen, have no fear. Because number two at the White House is here, Lael Brainerd, modern monetary theorist. She developed the CBDC with MIT working at the Boston Fed a few years ago when Biden fast-tracked it. She was number two under Powell. Before that, she was at the Treasury. And now she's number two in terms of economic policy at the White House. And she also ran point for Fed Now, which came out 6 months ago or so, which is Venmo and Zelle on steroids, being backed by the Fed, piloting right now by a handful of banks. It will replace checks and wires if it grows. So yeah, if you're not a contrarian and this thing breaks and interest rates spike as the world dumps dollars, why would they do this? Why would they want this? Because we have a $35 trillion debt and almost $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and we will never pay that back. So you can inflate, you can default, or you can find a villain. And that villain would be the rest of the world who dumped dollars. How could they do it to us? And the whole system implodes. But what's really interesting, Gary, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government military pensions, it's all owed to us. And who's been selling treasuries and buying gold? Japan, China, Saudi, Russia, all the central banks who have been funding our lifestyle have been selling for the last few years and buying commodities. And who's been buying all the treasuries? Oh, yeah, that's us. The banks, the mutual funds, the money markets, the hedge funds, everyone chasing yield. So when you reset the system and find a villain to blame, only 20% of the debt's owed to the rest of the world, 80% to us. And here's how you get people to take the CBDC. When you blow up the whole system, you say, those sons of bitches did it to us. But don't worry. Sign on the dotted line, Gary, and you too will be made whole. Take the CBDC, sell your soul, and we will make sure that you have all the money you need to take care of your family. Now, everything I said up to that point is factual. Occam's razor to me says, this is how you get people to take a CBDC. This is how you reset a system that is so far indebted. 1 trillion seconds ago, 31,688 years ago, we have a $200 trillion debt, both funded and unfunded obligation, and we are accumulating $1 trillion of debt every 100 days? Really? How do we pay that off? As rates go higher? This is a situation that is becoming scary and real, and to underestimate it, to not be a contrarian, that's why I believe you will be a victim. Hate to say it. I got 3 kids, man, but yeah, I think it's real.
So, you've touched on commodities throughout this first half of our conversation quite a bit, and I want to touch on that now. For the last 40 or so years, the 60-40 portfolio, that's worked well. In recent decades, passive flows from retirement accounts, automatic withdrawals, it's funneled massive amounts of investment dollars straight into the same companies, spiking their market caps. Before the pandemic, no company had a market cap in excess of $1 trillion. Today, there's 7, with 5 in excess of 2, 3 of them in excess of 3, and that's all happened in just the last 4 years. With that as the backdrop, and all the overvaluation and the concentration in these stocks that's happening, are you anticipating a rotation out of those and into what's been undervalued and lacking concentration, namely the hard assets? Are you looking for this rotation on a historic level? How do you see that playing out and over what time frame? I want to point everyone over to our Substack. It's free. Go to metalsandminers.substack.com. We post free content on the consumer, economy, markets, artificial intelligence, individual metals and miners, and every single expert interview that we conduct, just like this one. It's all up there. And when you subscribe, we want to give you a free gift. It's a report that we wrote based on the important Ray Dalio foundational premise titled, "If you don't own gold, you know neither history nor economics." This free gift is a must read for everyone on why we all should own gold. So head over to metalsandminers.substack.com, put in your email address to subscribe, and receive that free gift on us. Also, I'm positive that you've enjoyed this conversation with Andy as much as I have. Please let him know. hit that like and subscribe button and leave a comment below the video.